Hey guys, John here. So the biggest question I always get when I do these courses is where can I get access to the source code? So I obviously can't upload that here on YouTube, so I've made that available for you over on BitTorrent. And along with the source code, you'll also be able to actually download the videos to your computer so you can have them forever. So if for some reason something crazy happened and I decided to delete them, or YouTube kicked me off of their site or whatever, it wouldn't really matter for you, because you would have all the source code, you'd have all the videos, everything essentially that I've created for the course you would have on your own computer. So I've created a link in the description where you can find that stuff over on BitTorrent. Please consider going over there, supporting me that way. I'd appreciate that. Also, please consider making a donation here on YouTube using the fan funding. This is how, or one of the ways that I'm able to keep all of the videos that I'm doing and releasing here on YouTube for free, by those who are able to pitching in and allowing me to do that. So please consider that. And if you need access to any of the resources that I use through everything that I do online, coding, releasing videos, etc., you can head on over to johnmorrisonline.com/resources, and I have a whole slew of all sorts of different resources, from hosting to different tutorials and just everything over there that I do. So again, johnmorrisonline.com/resources. All right, on to the lesson.
Hey there, John Morris here. I'm the lead instructor for the Wishlist Member Certified Developers Program and the CEO here at johnmorrisonline.com. And in this video, we're going to cover the practical example for a liquid layout. Now, of course, if you watch the liquid layout approach video that kind of gives you the conceptual overview of what the liquid layout is, then you'll notice that you'll remember that I generally don't recommend this method for the majority of the sites that you're going to do. And the reason is because it becomes difficult when you have a liquid layout to design any sort of look and feel that has any complexity to it, when everything is going to be completely liquid and you have no fixed widths that you can design to. It becomes pretty difficult to create any kind of complex or more advanced design. So what you ultimately end up with, if you do go with a liquid layout, is something that is a very basic design. Now, there are small use cases for that sort of simplicity, and of course, looking here at the design that we're creating for this particular site or this practical exercise, you can see that the design is fairly simple and is primarily text-based, and that seems to be the more common use case for this kind of liquid layout. So immediately the question you might have is, well, does anybody do this? And the answer is there are a few people that do this. There is a small use case for it. And so one example is a site called Zen Habits by Leo Babauta, which is basically a blog, his blog, where he talks about all kinds of different things that he does and lessons and so forth. And you can see here that it's a really straightforward text-based type setup, and the entire site, if we go to the home page, the entire site is actually set up this way. This is the home page. If we go to see all posts, you can see it's just a really simple list. So a very simple text-based setup similar to this one. Now, I will say that when you look at it, there is a certain beauty and elegance to this kind of simple text-based setup, and in the right context, this can be a really great design for a client or for your site or whatever the case may be. But again, it has to be a pretty specific context where it's going to be primarily text-based, and you're not trying to do anything super complicated design-wise. And again, if we go over to Zen Habits, you'll notice that it's not actually 100% of a liquid layout. This is more of a good example of a text-based setup, because if we minimize our screen here and we come over, you notice that it stays at a fixed width, and it only changes right here at the end, right about 768 pixels, actually even less than that. You'll notice that the design changes just a little bit. The font gets a little bit smaller. I believe the padding around the edges here gets a little bit smaller, and it changes just ever so slightly at the end. So this isn't even really 100% of a liquid layout. This is more of a fixed grid, because it stays at a fixed grid all the way until right at the very end. Okay, you then contrast that with what we have here, where if we shrink this down, you'll notice that from the very beginning, everything is shrinking. It's stretching the majority of the page, and it just continues to do that all the way until the end, right here. So it keeps a fairly similar layout pretty much all the way through. And that's kind of the advantage of this, is that you don't really have to get too complex or too complicated with your CSS code to make this responsive. You essentially, you'll see that we set the width here of the container to 90%, and that's pretty much all we do. We don't do a ton. Really, the only thing we do in the media queries is we change the text. Okay, so again, fairly simple layout, this text-based layout, but in the right context, it can be it can work really, really well. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the actual code for this. All right, so here, let's go ahead and look at the HTML code first. I've covered a lot of this in the video for the fluid grid. So if you've been through that video, I covered a lot of this, but basically this is your kind of standard head tag, where you have your character set for your meta tag, your title. You have your viewport, which you pretty much always include in any sort of responsive design, so that the pixel relationship stays at a 1-to-1 scale. That makes it so that the device doesn't try and make your page responsive for you, I guess is the best way I would say that. You're going to do that on your own in your code. Meta description, author, these are all our OG, open graph, declarations here, title, image, URL, description. Then we're including some custom fonts, so these are just Google fonts. We're including a font icon, Font Awesome. That really we don't use in this particular design, but I'm showing you different ways, basically a way that you could kind of set up and organize your head tag here. And then we have our actual CSS file that we're using, and then I'm including jQuery here. Again, we don't use it, but it's just to show you how you might do that and how you might set this up in your head tag. All right, then we get into the body, and we have one section. Essentially, we have one section and then our footer, and this is where our main content is. You can see we're using the exact same kind of setup in terms of our HTML. So we have our container div, we have our row, and we have our post div here, and then inside that we're including basically all of our text and our code and our HTML tags for our content. Okay, so you would kind of set this up however you want, whether you're coding static HTML pages, you're using a template, website template, or you're using something like WordPress or whatever. You would set this up accordingly. Again, you'll notice we have the row and we have a span 12, so that means that we're at basically the max width. We're using all 12 columns, so this is whatever the container is at, this is going to stretch the full width of that container. All right, then down here we just have our footer. Again, we're in our container, our row, a span 12, and we just have our information about our copyright and just some crazy stuff I put in there. All right, so this layout's pretty straightforward. The main thing that we're looking at here is that we're in a span 12, because if we come over to our CSS, then that's where that's going to matter. Again, this is an HTML5 reset, so we're using the normalized reset. This just helps make our CSS work, or our code work with older browsers, is essentially what this is doing. So it's setting up some CSS that is now standard in modern browsers but wasn't in older browsers, and so it's making making those declarations so that that this will work similarly in older browsers as it does in new browsers. Obviously, that's not everything. That everything won't work exactly the same, but this helps out a ton. All right, so that's what all of this up here is until we get to this structure declaration here. In here, this is again all fairly standard stuff we've gone over. We have our container and row, display block, overflow hidden. That gets rid of our collapse, and display block helps with that as well. We have our container. We set to a width of 90%, margin 0 auto, so it's centering. So it's 90% width and it's centering. And then we're putting around our sections a padding of 50 pixels. You could probably even get rid of this if you wanted. We have for our spans, their float left, their box sizing, border box, and their padding 20 pixels. You notice that I still have all of the spans in here, all of the different columns in here. The reason that is because even with the liquid layout, you can still create columns, and so you want them percentage widths. The difference between a liquid layout and a fluid grid isn't on the span declarations, it's on this container declarations. Because if you remember in the fluid grid, this width was actually 100% by default, and then in the media queries down here, we would change it to a set pixel width, a fixed pixel width, and so it would change, and these spans would adapt inside of our container, because remember, our spans are inside of our container. Right here, you'll notice we set this to a width of 90%, and in our media queries, we're not doing anything to our container. We're letting it stay at 90%, and then the only thing that we're doing down here is we're changing the span widths to 100% once we get below 768 pixels. Okay, so that's why when we resize, we're always at 90% in the container, and then once we get down here, if we have any sort of divs, like we had a span 8 and a span 12 or a span 4, those would flip to the top to bottom mode once we got below 768 pixels. Now the reality is that when you're doing a liquid layout like this, you're probably not going to do a lot of side-by-side stuff because it really doesn't scale well, especially when you start getting to the smaller sizes. You might, but generally you're going to use full widths for everything that you do here. Right, so again, these all stay pretty much the same. The topography, again, this is all identical to what we covered in the fluid grid practical exercise. It's also identical to what we covered in the topography individual lesson. So there's really not a ton to cover here. If you haven't watched the topography individual lesson, then you want to do that, because I cover how you calculate all of these different font sizes. There's really nothing in here that's unique to, I mean, I think the actual sizes we went with are a little bit different, but I cover why that would be inside the individual lesson for responsive typesetting. So again, there's nothing unique here. Again, down here we talk about the modifiers that we can use for topography. So if we want something to be uppercase, instead of targeting that element individually and then making it uppercase, we can simply add an uppercase modifier to our HTML. So if we wanted to make our H1 tag uppercase, we could add a class of uppercase just like this. Instead of having to target, section content, post, H1, we can just add this class of uppercase. And then when we come back over, you can see that now we have this as uppercase. Okay, so that's essentially what we're looking at here with the modifiers. Here we're targeting something specific. The footer paragraph, we're targeting that specifically. There's instances where you need to do that. Again, the background colors, more modifiers. If we want to make the background color of something blue, we just add a class of background blue to the HTML tag. or dark gray or whatever the case may be. Same with alignment. If we want to align it center, right, left, we add that modifier to it. Here we're doing some specific stuff for the content. So we're setting the padding to 0. We're doing a margin bottom of 75 pixels to create some space between individual posts. Here we're styling the unordered list element. Essentially what that does is it creates these check marks right here. Okay. And so again, I cover that in the fluid grid in a little bit more detail, but it's not really 100% important to what we're covering in this practical example. This practical example is about the liquid layout, but these modifiers can be helpful, and this is just some default styling that we're doing to all of our unordered lists to make it look a little better. In our responsive section, like I said, all we're doing is modifying the text in our media queries here. There's nothing involving the liquid layout that we're modifying here. Again, I cover why and how you do this in the individual topography lesson. And then down here, once we reach a certain width, we're making all of our spans 100%. So we go from a side-by-side to a top-to-bottom format. All right, so again, the main thing here that's different from a fluid grid is this container class. It's set to a width of 90%. And it always stays that way. So that makes it so we could, if we wanted, change this to a span of 8. And let's go ahead. I think I might have a missing div tag here. Yeah, I did. That's funny. Anyway, if we do class of span 4 here, and we'll just put in this that says sidebar so we know we can see it. Okay, we can still get our side-by-side layout, but it's going to be 100% liquid. So now you see we have our sidebar over here, but as we shrink this, our sidebar is also shrinking. So if we had if we came over here and let's say we take some of this text and we put it in our sidebar so we can see it. And we head back over here. Let's refresh this. So we have this text over here. You'll notice that as we resize it, the size of that sidebar is constantly changing. The reason it doesn't work super well to do side by side is because when we get down to say like right here and we're getting close to this 768, you'll see that there's not a ton of room in the sidebar for us to put anything. Okay, if you're going to do that with this type of layout, you probably want to switch to a top to bottom type setup somewhere around, outside of the widest screens. Maybe once you get past the 980 width kind of grid, even this is pretty tight. Maybe at the 1024 or even wider. So you'd have to look at that with your design, but that's again why this doesn't work very well. It takes all the way down here before it flips to a top to bottom setup. Okay, so again, that's kind of the drawback of this liquid layout type setup. To do it, you almost always have to have you not be using a sidebar like that. You almost have to kind of keep everything full width and use span 12s for everything. Now again, if you set it up right and the context of your design is right, it can look really good. You can make it work really well, and it can be perfect for certain types of setups. With what Leo Bobota does on his side, I think it works really well. I think this looks really good for what it is. In this case, you would really focus heavily on the design of your text and your topography and how that looks, because that's going to be the primary way in which you present design to your readers. I don't think presenting just a completely plain text, Times New Roman, no differences between text and so forth type design looks good in any context. So if you're going to do a plain text full setup like this, then to me the the text becomes very important. That's where you're going to spend most of your time. All right, so again, that's a liquid layout. It's not as common. It's not something that's it's not recommended for a ton of situations or a ton of designs. But as I mentioned in the approach video, this liquid idea kind of gave birth to and helped advance what was used most common, which is the fluid grid. All right, so again, that's the liquid layout. That's kind of the ins and outs and how to set it up and how to use it and how to build a web page, website using it, the situations where you might do that, and some of the key things to keep in mind as you do. So hopefully you found that helpful, and I'll talk to you later.